Well, St Margaret's Churchyard is possibly one of the biggest churchyards in regular use in the United Kingdom. It's over 9 acres, so it is quite a large area of green space, and it is in regular use. So we have cremated remains, we have full burials take place on a regular basis. In many ways, the churchyard is a history of the town told in stone. We've got all kinds of different people from different walks of life. We have potters and artists, people who worked in the pottery industry in other capacities. We've got industrialists, glassmakers, we've got victims of industry like many coal miners who died in perishing accidents, for example, people who died on the railways. We've got war graves, people who gave their lives in both world wars but have their final resting place in Swinton. We've also got sporting personalities, we've got engineers, just people who in their lives really helped to shape the community. I said earlier on that churchyards can be like a story of the community told in stone, told by inscriptions, and this really does demonstrate that, this particular gravestone. This is the first person to actually be buried in the churchyard, and it's John Mann. He was called. He was and the lettering on the gravestone really tells its own story. John was formerly clerk to Swinton Chapel, and Swinton Chapel was a medieval chapel of ease. It wasn't its own parish. It dated back to the 12th century, and it was Norman in design. It was probably gifted by the Knights of St John of Jerusalem. But that's lost in the mists of time, really. And the Swinton Chapel was actually demolished when Swinton's new church opened in 1817. John Mann continued his job because he was also clerk to this church, as the stone says. Now John is buried slightly away from the church, and the reason for that is when he met his death, the church was not completed. It's understood that John was actually inspecting the roofing work which was going on the church, and actually fell to his death. He was 65 years of age when he died, so was quite, in 1817, would have been quite really elderly, really. And the irony really is he lost his life in that way. But it says he's the first person buried in this churchyard, so it's a really good reference point for Swinton. This is the grave memorial of William Landegg. He was one of the artists who worked at the pottery in Swinton. His main achievement was he developed a blackberry or raspberry border, typically around plates, which was a really fine, delicate fruit pattern. And it's really sought after in the ceramic world, but that was his invention. He died at the age of 30, but clearly he was an artist of some influence. In the world of ceramics, the name of Adams is very well known, and here we have the grave of Matthew Adams along with his wife Nancy. Matthew was actually recruited from the Staffordshire potteries from Hanley, and he moved to Swinton. Interestingly, he lived on a place called Well Lane, which was the site of the town's medieval town well. He died in 1855, but we actually do have a still photograph of Matthew. It's probably one of the oldest photographs we have of any Swinton resident. Their daughter's actually buried at the side of them here in this grave. The churchyard, we have quite close together the graves of Edwin Bagley and Alfred Bagley. These were the sons of Isaac Bagley, who was a painter that was attracted to Swinton from the Derby potteries. Isaac specialised in the painting of birds, but both his sons then went on to work in the industry. Alfred is quite interesting in his own respect, because after the pottery closed, the Bagleys continued to work on site, not manufacturing pots, but getting pots from other areas and still carrying out decorative work. And they continued on site for some time. And Alfred was actually a pioneer and kept the secret of what is known as the Bagley brown glaze, a secret formula which was only known to the family. After they ceased work in Swinton, he moved into like a shop premises in Mexborough and continued glazing pots from other potteries with the Bagley brown glaze. And again, this is another item of Swinton ceramic which is quite collectible and sought after in the antique world. What became known as Rockingham pottery did have a number of owners throughout the years, and a family that were strongly associated and helped develop it and transform the pottery was the Bramold family. John Bramold had a number of sons. William Bramold, he worked in the pottery business, he travelled extensively, and when he died, he was actually buried in Wath Churchyard, because before Swinton had a church, that's where Swinton's burials took place. Then we have this son here, which is Thomas Bramold. He unexpectedly became pottery manager. His grave is here in what we call Potter's Corner. His wife's Jane's buried at the side of him in this grave. And really Thomas really wanted to drive the pottery forward to become fine porcelain makers, and so we sort of owe that debt to him. There's a whole documented history of the Rockingham pottery, which we haven't really got time for to go into today, but it really is a fascinating history and a detailed history. George Bramold is another one of the individuals here in Potter's Corner, and he again travelled internationally, marketing the pots. He really raised the profile of it. The pots that were made in Swinton graced the tables of the landed gentry and monarchs throughout the world, really. There are collections in Russia. He's sold to Brazil and the other European captains particularly as well. This large upright stone reflects multiple interments in this grave, and we're looking at the name of Green, the family called Green. First person was Mary Green. She died in 1833, aged just 23 years of age. But it was her father, John Green, who we want to focus on. The Green family were proprietors of the Leeds pottery, and John came from that family. He resided at Newhill in Wath, and there was also pottery at Newhill there, which he was involved with. He then went on to establish the Swinton Don pottery, because we don't just want to talk about Rockingham. Swinton also had another very important pottery at the other end of town, built on some swampy land. Before the Don, he was actually one of the owners of the other pottery, which became Rockingham, at a time when the Bramolds were only employees there. So he sort of was senior to them, if you like, as a manufacturer. And so, not to be forgotten is the Don pottery, which again has its own fascinating history, extremely collectible, its own styles, its own distinctiveness, and quite ironically close in this area, which we call Potter's Corner, which is quite appropriate, really. There is a guidebook which is available, which speaks about some of the memorials in Swinton Churchyard. We have quite a number of sporting personalities as well. This is the grave of Herbert Crossley. Herbert was British novice heavyweight champion. He had a successful boxing career in United Kingdom, and he fought in London in the National Sporting Club. He was actually then spotted by an American boxing promoter by the name of Charles Harvey. And Charles Harvey encouraged him to go across to the USA to try his hand over there. He travelled to New York, and his first fight was against the famous great Gene Tunney, US boxer. He boxed well but lost on points. He was then slated to box with another American boxer called Al Roberts. It was a close fight, and again he lost on points, but many in the crowd thought he'd actually won. Unfortunately, after that fight, Herbert became ill, and he was admitted to Roosevelt Hospital in New York. Many people thought he died as a result of the boxing match, but it wasn't. It was actually he died of septicemia, and as his gravestone says, he died in New York, and then his body was transferred back to the United Kingdom by steamship, and this was one of the largest funerals that Swinton has ever seen, because it was such a tragedy that a promising young boxer, big local following, was to die so young, so far away from home. Herbert had a younger brother by the name of Harry, and Harry is also buried in Swinton Churchyard. And Harry went on to become the British Cruiserweight champion in the 1920s. He actually gained that title. When he retired from boxing, he moved to Leicestershire to take up the job of a publican. But when he died in the 1940s, again, that he wished to come back to his hometown of Swinton to be buried in Swinton Churchyard. So now we're visiting the final resting place of Alfred and Emily Liversidge. Alfred died in 1921. He was 86. He was a good age, and is another one of our sporting heroes. A very interesting guy, Alfred. He actually worked at Rockingham Pottery in his younger days. Then when the pottery closed, he transferred to the Holmes Pottery over in Rotherham. But his sporting achievements were quite interesting, because Alfred in his day was the fastest runner in road races in England. He was bet on heavily by the gentry. He was their champion, and he could beat any man. He was the fastest man in England. That wasn't the end of his sporting career, however. He then changed directions and he became a boxing trainer. And he actually trained a champion called Jem Mace. And Jem Mace was actually the last bare-knuckled heavyweight fighter, champion boxer. And then the Marquess of Queensberry rules came in, and they insisted that boxers then wore boxing gloves, and then they had to have timed rounds. But in the day, in Alfred's day and Jem Mace's day, they just battled it out with bare fists. Real tough guys. So come to this rather ornately carved headstone. It's like a tree with a cross piece. So really a lot of work's gone into this. We just need to reveal the inscription on the bottom. And it's actually, this is the grave of John William Q. And as the gravestone states, he was a police constable, and it says he died doing his duty. PCQ came from Lincolnshire originally. He had a wife and 4 children, and he patrolled the Piccadilly area of Swinton. And what happened on the night of July the 10th in 1900 was he heard about 2 brothers, the Backhouse brothers. Now these brothers had got a history of sort of domestic issues with Mrs. Backhouse, and PCQ was told by local residents that the brothers had actually acquired a revolver. And so PCQ went to find out what this was all about. And during the course of his duty, he was shot. He was shot twice by both Backhouse brothers. He was shot in the abdomen and he was shot in the leg. And the following day, he died in hospital. He died doing his duty. So the grave of a police officer killed while trying to protect the public back in 1900. Swinton in the First World War was home to a Victoria Cross recipient. Lance Corporal Thomas Norman Jackson he served in the 1st Battalion of the Coldstream Guards. He was involved in an attack on the Canal du Nord, and he lost his life on the 27th of September 1918. So he was awarded the VC posthumously. Along in the same action, his commanding officer, Captain Frisbee, also received the Victoria Cross, but Captain Frisbee survived. We marked his centenary with a range of community events in September 2018. That involved a concert to raise funds for local good causes. We had a parade through the town, a service of reflection and thanksgiving, and also an act of remembrance at the War Memorial to mark this important anniversary. The town is incredibly proud of Thomas Norman Jackson. He was only 21 years of age. He lived down at the bottom part of Swinton on a place called Market Street, which is still there. Before he enlisted, he worked as an engine cleaner at the nearby Mexborough locomotive depot, and so we remember him with pride. This actually is a family grave, and you can see that Thomas Norman Jackson's name is at the bottom, but that was just a family memorial. The family chose to honour him here. He's actually buried in northern France in a Commonwealth War Grave cemetery named Saunders Keep, quite close to the action of the Canal du Nord. His family received the Victoria Cross at Buckingham Palace from the King sometime after the war's end. In the churchyard there are quite a number of Commonwealth War Grave headstones. These stones are actually owned by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The design came about in a particular way. After the First World War, there was quite a lot of discussion on how the dead were going to be memorialised and what was going to be on the headstones. Were there going to be differentiations between officers and non-commissioned officers and other ranks? And it was decided that every soldier who had died or was killed in action or died of wounds would be given the same type of headstone. It was a standard design, a standard height, a standard width, and there would be a certain amount of standard information on that. And so the decision was taken that there would be a serial number, the rank, and the name of the soldier, and their regiment and date of death, a regimental badge, a religious symbol, which is a Christian cross, or it could have been the Star of David, or a Hindu symbol, etc. And then on the bottom, it was decided that there would be space for a few words chosen by the relatives, and often that is the most poignant thing. This example of a Commonwealth War Grave headstone is to Lance Sergeant William Phillips, who was served in the Royal Artillery. You can see his badge there. Interestingly, the date of his death is the 5th of June 1946. As we all know, the war ended in 1945, but Sergeant Phillips actually died of war-related illness. He died in Montague Hospital in Mexborough of war-related illness. So therefore is a war casualty, quite rightly classed as a war casualty, and it's also named on Swinton War Memorial. On Swinton's War Memorial, there is the name of a female soldier, and this is her resting place. We're talking about Alice Metcalf. She's in the family grave with a family memorial, not a Commonwealth War Grave headstone, although she would be entitled to such. Alice served as an anti-aircraft gunner, defending Britain against the bombing raids against the Luftwaffe. She was stationed in the Catterick area in North Yorkshire, and she became ill with peritonitis. So she was admitted to a military hospital and sadly died there. Was returned to Swinton for her burial. Quite rightly, she is commemorated on Swinton's War Memorial because she was a serving military personnel who died in that service in the Second World War. So the gravestone of the Drakeford family. We'll start off with Ernest Dixon Drakeford. Ernest was a bandsman on the ship the Lusitania. He was serving on the ship on the transatlantic trade when it was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland in 1915. Obviously survived the sinking. He came home and the family ran a shop in Swinton with his wife. He ran the shop with Priscilla, or Scylla as she was known, and she lived to a ripe old age. Now their son, Coder Sidney Drakeford, Royal Navy, is also mentioned on the grave. Now what happened to Sidney was he was serving in the Arctic Ocean in the Second World War, and his ship was struck by a German torpedo. So a German torpedo again affecting this family. The irony is just unbelievable. Swinton is a coalfield area, the South Yorkshire coalfield. Sadly now all the pits have gone, but employed thousands and thousands of people in the industry and the supply chain, and there was a steady attrition of miners who lost their lives, and it wasn't all in big accidents that are nationally known, but it was a steady attrition of people who lost their lives in a very dangerous industry. We've got this gentleman here, and it quite clearly states he was 46 years of age, 1957, and it says, who was accidentally killed at Mambus Colliery, one of our large pits in just a couple of miles from here. I just walk along a short distance, and again we find another miner here in the same year, accidentally killed at Mambus Colliery. It was a steady attrition of injuries and dangerous machinery and rock falls and so many different reasons why people lost their lives in the mines. Certainly was the price of coal. And just a little bit further on, we can find another grave here. This gentleman was accidentally killed at Kilness Colliery. And throughout the churchyard, you can find graves that state this, that state the person died as a result of their working in the coal industry. In the history of Swinton, the name of Harrop is quite prominent. And this gives an example of how you can actually trace the history of a family through their various memorials. Here we have the grave of William Harrop. He was a builder, he was a publican, he was the licensee of a pub called the Gate Inn in Swinton. He's buried with his wife Catherine and one of their sons, Edwin Thomas Harrop. At the side of their grave is the grave of Catherine's parents, which was Jonathan and Anne Lee. Their house still exists in Swinton as well. Edwin Thomas Harrop was a solicitor. He never married. He left a significant amount of money on his death. He was a landowner. He was a landlord, and quite prominent in the legal field. He was in partnership with his brother Frederick Lee Harrop. Now, Frederick Lee Harrop is a fascinating character. He was in private practice as a solicitor, but he was also a clerk to local government boards and the early councils. He actually worked in Parliament, giving evidence, framing local government legislation. He oversaw many developments in the town in that capacity. He was a great philanthropist as well. He was involved in the first time that the town of Rotherham had a hospital, for example. He was the first secretary of that. And moved the public health services along in many different fields. Now, as I said, Edwin was unmarried. Frederick Lee had two daughters, and the two daughters went on to inherit the family fortune, which was considerable. But they were also quite shrewd business ladies in their own account. And neither of them married, but they ended up being great benefactors to the town of Swinton. They funded, for example, a lich gate at the end of the Second World War as a memorial to the people of the area who'd served in both conflicts, First World War, Second World War. They donated a garden to the town, and also they left their Uncle Edwin's house to the town as well, and that became a clinic for child welfare services, for maternity, school medical services, and lasted the town right into the 1970s until it was sort of demolished for redevelopment, unfortunately. So the Harrop family, their story is fascinating, and again we can trace their memorials throughout the churchyard here. In the churchyard are quite a number of graves of former clergy. John Lowe was one of the first incumbents. Father Leslie Harris, who served in the 1970s, his cremated remains. But this gentleman is Father Herbert Querelle, and it says on the stone, priest, and he served this parish for many years, and until his death in 1962. He actually died in Dublin. He was on holiday in Ireland and he collapsed in the Dublin street. And but the enduring legacy of Father Querelle is he wrote a wonderful history of Swinton. He was asked to do that as part of the coronation celebrations of the early 1950s, and he pulled together this body of work, including medieval records and Georgian records, church records, and it's a really wonderful piece of literature. It's the history of Swinton by H.W. Querelle, and it certainly inspired me when I was a child, enjoying this book and learning about the past of our community. So just outside of the memorial window to his name and his family, we have the grave of Reverend John Levitt. Reverend Levitt was a very important figure in the clergy for Swinton. He was actually the very first full vicar prior to his appointment in 1851. The parish was just served by curates. So he was first accredited vicar. There's a stone image of him also looking over the grave area, which is quite a nice touch. During his time, Reverend Levitt worked closely with Dr. Blytheman, the medical officer of health, on public health improvements. Because during his period of 45 years as vicar of Swinton, a really long incumbency, the town grew rapidly. It became from what was possibly a small village into a booming Victorian industrial town. One of the issues was, though, most of the new building to accommodate the workforce, so housing, a whole huge variety of shops, pubs, and a school at Swinton Bridge was in the eastern area of the parish. And so the location of the church became somewhat remote from where the population growth was. And one of the initiatives that Reverend Levitt brought about was to appoint an assistant clergyman to act as like a missionary for the Swinton Bridge area. And a vexed question then came around about a sister church for that area of town, because services were actually being held in the schoolroom on Sundays. Reverend Levitt was conscious of the church's finance, and he actually resisted the calls for a church. And things became quite acrimonious. Reverend Levitt was a great campaigner for education, and as I said, public health. And he was often in conflict with people who thought, well, this is going to make costs on the rates. So there were quite acrimonious discussions going on. So Reverend Levitt actually left in quite bad terms after such a long time. It's quite a shame, really, that happened. When he passed away, he was actually brought back to Swinton to be buried because the grave was already here. His daughter had died while he was in charge, and so he returned to be laid to rest with his daughter. And then his wife passed away. She was also laid to rest here. And finally, his second daughter as well lived into the 1940s, and she also lies in the family plot. So Reverend Levitt, a great clergyman, a great benefactor to Swinton in many ways, other than the spiritual life, and forever his name will be associated with St Margaret's Church.